Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 38 cheat sheet. It is the final game week of the FPL season. For those interested in fantasy football in general, of course, the European fantasy cheat sheets would definitely be coming, so stay tuned for that sort of content. But for Game Week 38, for the final FPL game week of the 23-24 Premier League season, this is it. And what's interesting is that this is probably one of the few times in FPL in the previous years where we have a lot of big teams who have a lot to play for, right? A team like Man City historically have been pretty fortunate in that, or rather, unfortunate for us FPL managers, we own Man City players and they're probably less likely to play. However, this is a must-win game for all parties involved, right? For Arsenal, for City, and everyone's just going to try and maximize their European spots outside of Aston Villa. Liverpool, you could argue, have something going for them, and we'll talk about the narratives as we go forward, but let's just have a look at the midfield and just get started. The cheat sheet series, if you haven't watched it before, is just a rating of assets based on price point and position. So, of course, in terms of the color degradation, you can see that the green picks are our favorite ones for this week, the ones that we have the most comfort over. But it doesn't necessarily mean, particularly on Game Week 38, that we're that comfortable on them anyways, right? First of all, in Game Week 38, I think the thing that I have to mention is that all the games will be at the same time. So if you're sitting around for FPL, if there's ever a week where deadline leaks are very important because it's very likely that we will get them, this is the week to do so. When it comes to, let's say, lineups and teams that have something to play for, I think we have much more confidence over those teams. At the same time, though, you can see surprising things. For example, even though you could argue Liverpool have something to play for in terms of sending Klopp off, the reality, I think, is that you'll also maybe see that Klopp will also bring in some youth, right? Allow some more players to play minutes that haven't featured so much in the season, because at the end of the day, it's not necessarily a game where Liverpool have to win. And then let's just go quickly with the sort of budget position. So Elise for me is the favorite pick. He's a new pick as well, just simply because, of course, with the doubles and the preference over those picks, we have neglected Crystal Palace after Game Week 34. But the reality, of course, is that Elise, Mateta, even the likes of Eze, who's been a little bit more quiet compared to Mateta and Elise, those sorts of players have still been amazing going forwards. And Crystal Palace, if we ever talk form on the channel, they are really in form. I mean, they've gotten a lot of wins, but just when you look at underlying stats as well, they have dominated quite a few of their opponents. And I think even the Newcastle game was very impressive when they were playing at home, despite what we think about Newcastle offense and things like that. So Elise for me is the most interesting pick. When you look at his expected goal involvement at this sort of price point, it is ludicrous. To be honest, the only thing that makes Elise look a little bit worse is that Johnson right below him, who's also a very cheap option, who's also very good because of the injuries that this Spurs squad has faced, unfortunately, has elite stats as well. When you actually compare, let's say, the likes of Elise to Johnson, and then actually compare to, the Fodens of the world, the Havertz of the world, it's actually very surprising to see how close Elise and Johnson are. And the nice thing about these two players is that they're quite expected goal dominant as well, which means, of course, you can have more expectations for them when it comes to points because, the goal scoring matters a lot more in the midfield position. As far as the next tier, it's Hudson-Odoi and Gibbs-White. I think Hudson-Odoi has been included because, of course, when it comes to Game Week 38, you are looking for a one-week punt. For Nottingham Forest, of course, one of the most informed players right now is Hudson-Odoi. So, taking maybe out of account the lack of minutes he's had this season due to injuries, due to maybe, of course, times where other players have been preferred over him, I do think he has been very important for Nottingham Forest as of late. So it's very hard to see him not getting the minutes required for him to be a very good pick in FPL in a week where he gets to face a relatively easy opponent away from home. Nottingham Forest still have something to play for. Of course, it makes the most sense for them to see this game out, to win this game. And I think this is a good opportunity to hedge your bets on potentially players in a budget price point who will also be huge differentials, right? No one owns Hudson-Odoi. No one really owns Gibbs-White at this moment in time. They are going to be the consistent picks that you could look at in the midfield position where generally I think you're looking at an ownership of 1 to 2%, but maybe the outcomes can be very good. With Harvey Elliott, he's an interesting one because recently we've seen him be more integrated into the Liverpool starting lineup. The issue with Elliott historically, of course, is whether he's been sort of categorized by Klopp as a right winger, someone who actually takes or fills in Salah minutes, or of course at times sort of takes the right center mid spot, and usually as a late substitute. Recently, though, he has been getting the minutes that he'd like to have, of course, as a starter, and I think that's very nice for Elliott. The concern that I have with Elliott and why I have the asterisk, of course, is that there still is a world where he might not start. So I think, Elliott is not the type of punt that I would go for unless I was absolutely sure he starts. On top of that, as I said, it's very likely that Liverpool, with the amount of depth that they still have in the midfield position, that they could still bring him off early. And that is a small concern. So drawing back to that, Liverpool versus Wolves, though, is just a singularly great game. So I don't think I have any complaints really about that. Adingra actually has a great game versus Man United, but I still think that ultimately, am I that confident in Adingra? Not really. When you look at the underlying stats, I think that shows you why. Brighton have been a pretty resolute team, I think, over the course of the season. Yes, of course, they dropped off massively when it comes to defense recently, but it's not like they've been poor, right? They have comfortably been a top half team for this season. Adingra has been a comfortably key asset for them, key player for them. So for me, the way I see it, his underlying stats are a little bit subpar. I would take the opportunity to jump on players who are, with better fixtures, or at least have the intangibles. So, for example, with Gibbs White, you could argue that maybe there's a 50% chance he's on penalties. I think it's still undetermined whether Wood or him will take, but he's firmly, of course, on corners and other set-piece duties as well. As far as Gallagher, he's on set-piece duties. He is at home versus Bournemouth, but that recent early substitution in the previous game, and I'm saying this before, I don't know what Gallagher is going to do in the next game here versus Brighton. As I said, I am recording this video before the Brighton game, just because I will be occupied, and unfortunately, hopefully the cheat sheet will stand up for Game Week 38, but Gallagher for me is still a pick that I wouldn't be that interested in. I've also taken Madueke out of the cheat sheet because we're starting to see a lot of players come back into the team, right? Reece James occupying right back minutes could also allow Gusto to push up like he did in the first game versus Nottingham Forest. On top of that, too, Sterling is back as well, so him and Nkunku coming back will probably take away the minutes from Madueke and Mudryk, as opposed to, let's say, the Jacksons of the world. Garnacho also drops. It's an away fixture. United just look absolutely awful. I don't know whether Bruno's going to be fit for the final game of the season. It's an away fixture as well. I don't really see the need to necessarily risk some of United's key players when their most important game of the season arguably is going to be that FA Cup game. And when we move on to the next tier, we have Eze, who for the same reasons as Olise is very interesting. Now, Eze, as you can see, actually has slightly higher expected goal involvement per 90, but I think if you take away the penalties, is actually skewed towards Olise, who also is a little bit more expected goal dominant. On top of that, too, I think you can just generally say as well that Olise probably does look like a better ball striker than Eze. Maybe that's a take that will need to stand the test of time. But I think with Eze, you can say that his intangibles are that he probably is the penalty taker for this team. So as far as I understand, he should be taking penalties. Maybe there's, of course, circumstances where if Olise draws the penalty, he could take, or if Mateta draws the penalty, he could take. But I think that's something that's very positive going for Eze, and I still think he's a great punt, given that, of course, Aston Villa are quote-unquote on the beach. Palmer, nothing to talk about. Trossard, for me, is a fantastic punt as well. Similar to Elliott, right, where I think, when Trossard gets to start, he is an interesting pick. But, of course, the difference is he is the left wing for Arsenal compared to Elliott, who right now is playing right center mid. The only thing I'll say, of course, is that the competing matchups, when I, let's say, compare an Elliott versus Wolves, that's so much easier than a matchup like Arsenal versus Everton. Everton have been a very resolute defense for the season. And, of course, even though they have, capitulated at times, right? For example, the 6-0 versus Chelsea was an aberration. And then Everton basically went on a barrage of clean sheets. But the reality is Everton, over the course of the season, have been a very strong defense. So that is something that is I think, against the favor of Trossard, but he has just been extremely clinical. He's had the minutes so far, so I think he's a very good differential for this week. With Gross, I think with João Pedro, potentially being out, but then also just the reality of Gross getting to play versus Man United, I think that's a huge boost. It's a good fixture in isolation, so I really wouldn't mind Gross so much. Compared to Adingra as well, the reason why I like Gross more, of course, is the set pieces. And, of course, if, let's say, João Pedro's recovering from his ankle injury and he might be selected for the team versus Chelsea, right, which I think is likely going to happen based on what Roberto De Zerbi has confirmed to us already, I still think, of course, that João Pedro can be an early substitution in Game Week 38, and maybe you could see Gross as well, get penalties late, which is also very important. With Havertz, for me, he still remains as a key pick. Luis Diaz and Maddison get rises. These, of course, have been players that for the second half of the season have been very disappointing for a lot of managers who've owned them. I've owned Luis Diaz. Some owners have owned Maddison, unfortunately. And, of course, it seems like both players have been struggling, right? Luis Diaz, in terms of opportunities, hasn't really taken them. Maddison, in general, in terms of, overall play, when you see the underlying stats are so low, even as a set-piece taker as well, that's quite concerning. But I think, really, the best game of Maddison that I've seen recently was the Man City game. And I think that you could argue, hopefully, is, something that can allow him to turn around the corner and just end the season on a high. And I really think that Maddison played well in that game, so I'd be surprised if Maddison would be benched like he has been in recent matches. I tend to think that Maddison will play probably 90 minutes once again. And I think it's a great game for Maddison to play 90 minutes in Sheffield United away from home. As far as the other changes in terms of the elite picks for the midfield, no changes here right now. So we'll just quickly shift on over towards the forward position. But of course, I think maybe some people would like me to talk about Saka and Son. Yes, of course, I think Saka didn't look good versus United, and Son recently just has been poor, right? The finishing has been poor. Arguably, you can say that the chances have been poor, but I disagree, right? When you look at the games, like for example, the Man City game, even the Liverpool game, he's had chances and he will continue to get chances as an attacker versus some relatively weak opponents, and just in general, for example, having intangibles like penalties, but then also, you know, with his own skill, of course, getting into great positions like he did in the Man City game. My only concern, of course, with Son is whether he'll actually play 90 minutes. I think he will. I just think that they're so down on personnel that there's nothing really going against Son as a pick. Yes, of course, he's played poorly, but I really think you can't dismiss the fact that he's playing for Sheffield United. And then second of all, ultimately has all these intangibles in play where, you know, if you had the luxury transfer to move away from Son to Salah, maybe I'd consider it. Maybe Son to De Bruyne, I'd consider it. But in reality, because of course there's such a big difference in price between someone like Son and Salah, I think it's very unlikely that you'll be able to do so. So of course, that is the only consideration on Son that I'll mention. As far as Saka, depending on what Arteta confirms to us in terms of his availability for this Everton game, I think that completely changes, you know, our estimate and our opinion of Saka. So the asterisk is there. I probably prefer Havertz as a pick if I had to choose to make a transfer, but I own Saka right now as an FPL manager, and I'm not necessarily keen to just shift him on out. I do have the opportunity, arguably, to make a luxury transfer, but that also depends on, you know, my ownership of Alexander Isak to bring my sort of personal context into play. As far as the forwards here, this is a week where I think, once again, a lot of people will actually be considering the forwards as a make weight to get Salah into the team, right? I think the lucrative element of the Wolves game for Salah is very interesting. And of course, it means that you probably have to downgrade one of the forwards that we've recently been spending a lot of money on, right? Your Jacksons, your Isaks of the world. Probably Isak, to be honest, given his pricing. Isak, of course, doesn't necessarily have a great game. He's versus a pretty strong defense in Brentford. He's also away from home. We also know that he hasn't been training recently, and he's felt under the weather. At least that's what Eddie Howe has confirmed. I don't know whether, you know, it's sickness, it's an injury or whatever, but it is concerning. And I think you can mention that there is a little bit of upside here if you have 2 free transfers to just simply go towards Salah and to forget about Isak altogether. With João Pedro, I think if he's available and fit to play and fit to start versus United, I think he becomes an amazing pick. United have looked awful. The defense still looks really poor away from home. No complaints really with someone who's on set pieces, on penalties as well. Not set pieces, sorry, but on penalties. As far as Adebayo, he's an interesting pick where I think, of course, when it comes to, you know, the importance of the fixture, this is something that Luton definitely have to play for. And of course, whilst simultaneously Nottingham Forest will also be playing, the reality is Luton is going to try their absolute best to do well. And Adebayo, of course, I think we've seen for this Luton team that has been very depleted on personnel will just simply be a great pick for this game week. He is the key threat. He is the central threat as well. So when Adebayo plays, someone like Morris drops a little bit deeper. Adebayo is therefore the best pick to go for as a forward. So I think he's a very interesting differential here, particularly considering too that, you know, they're at home. And Luton, if anything, from all the relegated sides or about to be relegated sides, unfortunately, maybe Nottingham Forest can change the turn of the tide. But look, in reality, Luton have been one of the few teams amongst Sheffield United and Burnley that have been very composed on the attacking front. And we can take reliance on that. As far as Muniz, Mateta, and Wood, I think they all have great underlying stats and they all have to rise as well. They all have great fixtures to close the season. Muniz, you know, ultimately is going to be away from home versus a very, very fragile Luton defense. So whilst I can give credit to Luton as an offense, I can also give them discredit as a defense. Muniz is someone who could probably benefit from that. However, I will also say that Muniz's minutes recently have been a little bit worse. So I think you can argue that maybe he's not going to be as exciting as a pick because his minutes have dwindled recently. Whereas compared to, let's say, Mateta in a team that's much more on fire, you'd say that even within the 65, maybe 75 minutes that he gets to play, that he's still a very interesting pick. With Wood, I think he just has an all-important game here. So for me, he's a great pick. No complaints about him, really. And that's pretty much the landscape of the forwards, right? With Gakpo, I think you have a differential here. If you can get Leeds lineups from Liverpool, he'll probably play 70, 75 minutes in the game and maybe be subbed off, but that could be good enough, right? Because if you're thinking that Liverpool can absolutely destroy Wolves, which is very possible, Wolves have been a very fragile on the beach team as of late, Gakpo could be a very good differential with Isak for the reasons that I mentioned in the outset. I think he does deserve to fall. In the defense, I think this is probably the most boring position this week. I think the only thing that might be of interest is for the managers who have recently owned Guardiola, Porro, Gabriel, plus another Arsenal defender. You could arguably be playing 4 at the back this week, and that's something that I think is quite interesting. Beyond that, I really do not think that there are too many punts that you can go for unless you are an extremely rich manager or someone who is cash rich right now and has the opportunity to go for Alexander-Arnold in this final game here. We saw that Robertson was actually someone who was, not included within the last Liverpool squad in Game Week 37. So there are definitely significant doubts over his availability for Game Week 38. And that just makes Trent, even better as a punt, really, because, no one can really hedge with Liverpool defense unless they go for Virgil van Dijk or Alisson, which is obviously quite a miles off away from what Trent can provide as quality. Yes, of course, they looked really poor versus Aston Villa, but I have to say that Trent still looked brilliant. He still had great chances to even score, for example, in that game. And that's the Trent that we all know and love in FPL. So I think for me, he is the only interesting differential punt in the FPL position here of defense. As far as the budget players, I've only really given them drops, right? Cucurella drops because is it that exciting a Bournemouth game when we probably all own an Arsenal defender, maybe a City defender as well, maybe even a Spurs defender like Porro, who ultimately has Sheffield United away, which is, I think, is still a better game on paper. As far as Doughty, I think he's actually quite interesting if you really want to save your budget, or maybe you're going for a free hit and somehow have to squeeze in the funds so that you can afford a Salah Haaland team. Doughty could be interesting just because ultimately, right, he is a set piece taker, which is nice. He is at home, which is nice. But of course, we do know Luton's defense, there is a big flip side to that. So that's why he's not going to be a green pick for the purposes of this game week. With Cucurella too, just quickly speak on him, even though I think he's nailed for this Chelsea team, the sort of role that he operates in this team is almost like a defensive mid. So I feel like the chances that he'll get in this game are very rare. Sometimes, of course, when we saw Cucurella play more of a traditional fullback role, you'll see him go much more on the overlap on the left, and therefore he can sort of whip in across. And I think a good example of that is if you look at the Aston Villa game, the Jackson chance where he hit the post with a header, that's a good chance of Cucurella. But, since inverting, Cucurella actually doesn't really look like someone who's that interesting, I suppose, when you compare him to the elite fullbacks within the game. As far as Romero, he drops as well. And that's pretty much it. You can maybe go for a Virgil van Dijk punt if you really believe in the Liverpool narrative and can finally cash in on one of the greatest aerial threats within the Premier League, hopefully scoring a goal finally from a set piece. But that's that in terms of the defense. And then with the goalkeepers, similar changes here where we have Alisson being new, Leno being new, just because these are good shot stoppers. These are good goalkeepers. They have good fixtures in terms of opportunities to get a clean sheet, one, or at least with Leno's situation, a good opportunity to get maybe, something in return here away from home versus a still pretty weak Luton team. As far as Petrovic, he drops for the same reason. I think Raya, Vicario, Ederson are probably the most interesting picks. Ederson, of course, has a huge and major asterisk around him, but I'm not going to drop him for the purposes of this game week for the last week of FPL. He either plays or he doesn't. Assuming that you have a bench boost, you probably have a backup keeper anyways. Assuming that maybe you have, let's say, Petrovic or Vicario, I think you're totally fine. If you don't have a keeper and you have Ederson, probably this is the time to make that transfer towards going to Guardiola. And, if it's for a hit, I probably would still consider it because ultimately Guardiola's positioning right now is still ludicrous. And that's it. That's going to be it for the cheat sheet for this game week and for this FPL season. Thank you guys so much for watching all the videos. Take care and goodbye.